It was a Thursday evening, and Brandon Lee's shift had ended like any other. He drove home exhausted, the summer sun dipping behind the rooftops of his peaceful cul-de-sac in the Whispering Pines community. As he turned onto his street, something felt off, a strange gap in the rhythm of the view. His pulse quickened. His driveway was empty. He blinked, slammed the brakes, parked sideways and got out, heart pounding. His silver Honda Civic, the one he had parked in the same spot every evening for 6 years, was gone. Brandon spun around. No broken glass, no tire marks. Just the faint hiss of sprinklers from a neighbor's lawn and the quiet hum of suburban silence. He called the police. They told him it hadn't been stolen. It had been towed, by request of the HOA. He didn't believe it at first. He walked to the HOA office, locked a generic sign said open Monfry, 10 to 4. It was 6:45 p.m. He banged the door anyway. Nothing. He tried calling the number on their website, straight to voicemail. When he finally reached the towing company, the voice on the other end sounded rehearsed, robotic. Vehicle removed under HOA directive. You'll need to pay $275 for release. Daily fees accrue after midnight. Brandon's voice cracked. What violation? I wasn't even notified. That's between you and your HOA, sir. The call dropped. That night, Brandon couldn't sleep. He walked the neighborhood like a man in mourning. No signs forbidding parking. No citations left on his windshield. No neighbors had seen anything, just silence, and one familiar refrain. That HOA has been getting worse ever since Meredith took over. The name made him pause. Meredith Grayson, the new HOA president. A former real estate agent with a glass smile and an iron will. She ran the board like a private fiefdom, slapping fines, rewriting rules, and cherry-picking who to target. Brandon had kept his distance. Until now. The next morning, he marched into the HOA office. Meredith was there, filing her nails behind a polished desk like a queen on her throne. She barely looked up. I need an explanation for why my car was towed, Brandon demanded. She raised an eyebrow. Per HOA regulations, commercial vehicles aren't allowed overnight. It's not a commercial vehicle. It's my personal car. Registered to me. No decals, no modifications, nothing. She shrugged. Well, to the board, it looked commercial. And you didn't think a warning was necessary? A smirk curled at the corner of her lips. We reserve the right to act immediately in cases of community standards. You can always file a complaint. Good luck with that. Brandon clenched his jaw. In her smile, he saw something darker, something deliberate. This wasn't a mistake. This was targeted. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A clipboard on the receptionist's desk, partially covered by a folder. Names, license plates, dates. His was one of them. Next to it, a note. Clear by Thursday. Don't warn, just remove. The room spun slightly. He snapped a photo before anyone noticed. That night, Brandon sat in his kitchen. Phone in one hand, laptop in the other, pulling up every document he could find about Whispering Pines HOA. Rules, meeting notes, financial reports. A plan started forming. He wasn't just going to get his car back. He was going to tear Meredith's little empire apart. One document, one secret, and one courtroom at a time. By sunrise the next day, Brandon had already read the Whispering Pines HOA Handbook 3 times. It was vague, intentionally so. Rules were buried in convoluted paragraphs, with loopholes wide enough to drive a semi through. But one clause stood out. Vehicles deemed in violation may be subject to towing with proper notice. The words proper notice echoed in his head like a challenge. He never got a notice. Not in his mailbox. Not on his windshield. Not even a call or email. Still seething, Brandon drove to the impound lot. His Civic sat behind a chain-link fence, looking strangely helpless, like a dog in a cage. A gruff attendant took his $275 and handed him the keys without a word. Brandon asked for a receipt. The man slid a greasy carbon copy across the counter, and Brandon scanned it. There it was, authorized by HOA G. Grayson. He stared. Grayson, not Meredith Grayson. G. Grayson. Curious now, Brandon asked, Hey, is that the same Grayson from Whispering Pines HOA? The man leaned forward with a smirk. Yeah, her brother, Greg, owns the towing company. Been working together for years. Brandon's stomach turned. Now it all made sense. The casual confidence, the smug smile, this wasn't enforcement. It was a racket. He got back in his car and sat for a long moment. The engine hummed. A plan was forming, but he needed proof. Hard evidence. And for that, he'd need help. He visited Mrs. Callahan 3 doors down, an elderly widow whose rose garden was once the envy of the street. She answered the door slowly, peering around it with tired eyes. "Brandon, everything okay? I need to ask you something. Did the HOA ever fine you for your gardening fence?" Her lips pressed into a line. She stepped outside, lowered her voice. "They fined me $500. Called it an unauthorized barrier. I cried in front of that woman, and she said I should be grateful it wasn't more. I had to tear it all out." Brandon told her what happened to his car. Her eyes widened, then she looked over her shoulder and nodded. "You're not the only one." That afternoon, Brandon knocked on 6 more doors. He heard story after story, petty fines, aggressive letters, sudden rule changes, a single mom who got charged $100 for leaving a bike on the porch, a retired couple fined for painting their mailbox to bright, and more than one who had their car towed. All without notice. He began documenting it all. Names, dates, photos of fines and letters. He created a shared Google Drive and invited every resident willing to speak up. Within 24 hours, it was filled with PDFs, scanned forms, even voicemails from Meredith herself. But it wasn't just residents joining him. One message came from a former HOA board member, anonymous, no name, just a burner email. "Check the March 3rd meeting minutes. And follow the money. You're not crazy, but you're in deep now. Careful who you trust." Brandon's heart skipped. He downloaded the March 3rd minutes. They seemed ordinary until the financial section. There, buried in a tiny footnote, was a payment of $3,800 to Grayson Property Logistics, the towing company, listed as community services. He looked it up. There was no business license under that name. It was a shell. This was bigger than his car. It was systemic corruption, money laundering, abuse of power, and the best part, every lie they'd buried had left a paper trail. He just had to follow it far enough. Brandon leaned back in his chair, stared at the ceiling, and smiled for the first time in days. They had taken his car. He was going to take their whole kingdom. Brandon didn't sleep that night. Instead, he cross-checked every meeting minute from the past 2 years against local business filings, HOA expense reports, and every recorded tow. A pattern emerged, chilling in its precision. Cars disappeared just before key meetings. Residents who questioned the board suddenly found themselves penalized for obscure violations, and always, behind the scenes, payments quietly funneled to Grayson Property Logistics. He started building a file. Not a complaint, a case. He titled it Operation Curbside Justice. By Friday, Brandon had over 30 pages of documentation, photos, scanned fines, audio recordings, and neighborhood testimonials. The HOA's corruption wasn't subtle. It was masked in formality, but sloppily so, the kind of arrogance that creeps in when people think they'll never be challenged. He needed someone who could strike back with real force, so he made a call, not to a lawyer yet, but to his cousin Rachel, a paralegal at a local civil litigation firm. She listened patiently as he laid out everything. The silence on her end stretched longer than he liked. "You sure you want to go after your HOA?" she asked finally. "They're nasty. And they fight dirty." "They already did," Brandon said. "I'm not backing down." That evening, Rachel sent him a list of attorneys who specialized in HOA abuse and civil fraud. One name stood out, Eric Donner, known for taking on homeowner associations and winning. Brandon sent an email. Donner replied within 2 hours. They met at a quiet coffee shop the next morning. Donner was sharp.com and laser-focused. "Let me guess," he said before Brandon had even finished explaining. "The HOA president has a relative who runs the towing company. They towed your car without notice, and now they're covering it up under the guise of enforcement." Brandon blinked. "Exactly," Donner chuckled. "You'd be surprised how often this happens. What's different is, you actually kept receipts." Brandon handed over a thick folder. Donner flipped through it, his eyes narrowing with interest. "This isn't just HOA abuse," he said slowly. "This might be criminal fraud, misuse of community funds, possibly even racketeering. If we build this right, we're not talking about a warning letter. We're talking about court." Brandon's heart thudded. He could see it now, Meredith's smug face melting under the weight of a subpoena. Donner leaned in. But if we're going after them, we go all in. No bluffing. I'll need signed testimonies. Residents willing to speak. A judge who won't bend, and most of all, he looked Brandon square in the eye. You need to be prepared. They'll retaliate. Brandon nodded. I'm ready. By the following week, the first legal notice was delivered to the Whispering Pines HOA board, a cease and desist for unlawful towing and a demand for reimbursement. The board ignored it, so Donner escalated. The lawsuit was filed in county court. Brandon Lee versus Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, Meredith Grayson, and Greg Grayson. Word spread fast. Some neighbors were afraid. Others were angry. But many were relieved. Finally, someone was standing up. Brandon received quiet nods, whispered thank yous at the mailbox. Even a plate of brownies left on his porch with a handwritten note. About time someone fought back. But not everyone was supportive. One night, Brandon found a fresh violation, taped to his door mailbox, not properly aligned. A $50 fine. The next day, his trash cans were cited for being visible from the street. Another $1 to $5. It was petty, transparent, but it was also proof. Retaliation in plain sight. He photographed everything, every absurd violation, every time-stamped threat. Each fine became another nail in the HOA's coffin. And still, Meredith remained silent. But Brandon could feel it. The board was rattled. The whispers were turning into noise. Fear was beginning to change sides, and the storm he'd been waiting for. It had finally arrived. The envelope arrived on a humid Monday morning. Official court seal. Certified mail. And inside a neatly stapled packet stamped with the words, summons, to appear. Every board member of the Whispering Pines HOA had been named. Brandon stood at the edge of his porch, watching the mail carrier walk off like nothing had changed. But everything had. For 2 years, the board had ruled unchecked. Now they were being dragged into the one place they couldn't manipulate, a courtroom, by 9 a.m. News of the summons swept the neighborhood. Brandon's phone buzzed constantly. Texts, voicemails, even knocks at the door. Some residents were panicked, afraid of retaliation. Others were furious they hadn't acted sooner. And one message stood out, an anonymous tip. Check behind Unit 42. Cameras saw Grayson towing at 2 a.m. No lights, no paperwork. Towing truck is unmarked. You didn't lose your car, they stole it. Brandon's breath caught. Unit 42 was on the edge of the neighborhood, close to the maintenance shed. He grabbed his keys and drove there. Behind the bushes, facing a gravel alley, was an old electrical pole. And just above it, a small security camera, angled downward. Faded, but still recording. He followed the pole line to the source, a nearby rental property owned by an elderly couple, the Vasquezes. Mr. Vasquez invited him in with a smile. Brandon explained what he was looking for. Mr. Vasquez's eyes twinkled as he motioned toward his laptop. That old camera. Still works. My grandson set it up. The footage was grainy, time-stamped. Fast-forwarded to the night Brandon's car vanished. At 2:08 a.m., a black tow truck crept into view, lights off, no company decals. The driver stepped out. Brandon froze. The side profile was unmistakable, Greg Grayson. He didn't post a notice, didn't knock. Just hitched the Civic and drove. Off in under 3 minutes. Silent, clean, illegally fast. Brandon copied the footage. It was the final crack in the board's glass house. Meanwhile, inside HOA headquarters, panic was setting in. At the next monthly board meeting, Meredith tried to keep up appearances. She dressed in a bright teal blazer, hair sprayed to perfection, her voice syrupy sweet, but the usual smirk was gone. Her words were stiff, forced, defensive. Only 12 residents showed up, but every one of them stared her down like jurors. We'd like to address the pending lawsuit, someone finally said. Meredith blinked. The board cannot comment on ongoing litigation. But is it true? Asked Mrs. Callahan, arms crossed. Did your brother tow our cars without notice? Are we paying him from our dues? Meredith stood. This meeting is adjourned. But before she could step away, a man in the back raised a phone. Smile, he said. You've just been served. An official process server, dressed in plain clothes, walked down the aisle and placed a second summons directly into her hand. Her face drained of color. A flash from someone's phone lit the moment, a photo that would soon go viral in the community. Group chat. Brandon wasn't even there. He didn't need to be because by the next morning 3 more residents joined. The lawsuit as Brandon's lawyer, Eric Donner, filed a motion to subpoena HOA financial records and meeting logs, and the judge granted it. The HOA was officially under investigation. As for Meredith, she held an emergency closed-door session that same night. But it was too late. Rumors of resignations, deleted files, and frantic calls to their insurance company were already flying. Brandon, meanwhile, was working late at his desk, now building a timeline. Every illegal tow, every dirty payment, every neighbor's fine, and, right at the top, a still frame from the footage, Greg Grayson's blurry face. Illuminated by moonlight, they had cracked his car off the curb like it was nothing. Now, he was cracking open their empire, piece by piece. The courthouse was quiet that morning, except for the soft clicks of heels on tile and the low murmur of voices waiting for their turn before the judge. But in courtroom 3B, tension buzzed like a live wire. Brandon sat calmly at the plaintiff's table, flanked by his attorney, Eric Donner, and 3 neighbors who had officially joined the lawsuit. Across from them, the HOA board looked like a lineup of wax figures melting under pressure. Meredith Grayson stared ahead stiffly, lips pursed, her once flawless confidence cracking like cheap porcelain. Greg Grayson wasn't in the room yet. The bailiff called the case. Lee versus Whispering Pines HOA. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Honorable Marissa Caldwell, scanned the docket with practiced disinterest till she reached the exhibits section. "Is this correct?" she asked. The plaintiff is alleging illegal vehicle towing, fraudulent misuse of community funds, and conflicts of interest involving board members and a private towing company. Donner stood. "Yes, Your Honor. And we have the evidence to prove it." From the first moment, the case hit like a freight train. Donner began, with calm precision, presenting the March 3rd meeting minutes. He highlighted the payment to Grayson Property Logistics, then showed business filings proving the company had no legal registration with the city. The room stiffened. Meredith glanced nervously at her counsel. Then came the testimonies. Mrs. Callahan, frail but fearless, took the stand first. "They fined me for my garden," she said softly, her voice trembling but steady. "But it wasn't about the flowers. It was because I asked questions. After that, they threatened to place a lien on my home." The next witness was Jason Kim, a contractor whose truck had been towed at 3 a.m., no ticket, no call, just gone, he said. "They charged me over $400, said it was a community eyesore, but they never said that until after it was towed." The courtroom shifted. The jury took notes. Even the judge's brow furrowed deeper. Then came the kill shot. Donner introduced the grainy surveillance footage, time-stamped, verified, and damning. On the large screen, Greg Grayson emerged like a ghost in the night, hooking up Brandon's car without lights, warning, or documentation. Just a man taking what wasn't his. And then Donner dropped the final bombshell. The side-by-side comparison of the HOA's official towing policy and the actual receipts Brandon had pulled from the impound lot, all signed by Greg, all billed at inflated rates, and all funneling back to a business that technically didn't exist. Meredith's lawyer stood and objected. Circumstantial. No direct evidence this was intentional fraud. But Donner didn't flinch. He walked to the table and pulled out an email. Obtained through discovery, it was from Meredith to Greg. "Need that Civic off the driveway before the next meeting. Don't ask, just handle it quietly. And don't leave a notice this time. He's been poking around too much." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The judge banged her gavel. "Order." Brandon turned his eyes to Meredith. She refused to look back. Her skin was pale now, her hands trembling. She whispered to her attorney, who looked equally rattled outside the courthouse. Local reporters had gathered. Rumors had spread that this case wasn't just about a car. It was about an entire HOA regime built on silence, fear, and misuse of power. As the day ended and court recessed, the HOA's legal team requested a settlement discussion, but Brandon wasn't done yet. In the hallway, Donner turned to him. "They'll offer a deal, probably a big one. Want to take it?" Brandon stared at the courtroom door. "No. I want every lie exposed. I want it on record. Because it wasn't about money anymore. It was about making sure this never happened to anyone else again by the second week of trial." Courtroom 3B felt more like a public reckoning than a civil lawsuit. Every seat was filled. Residents from Whispering Pines lined the pews like spectators at a spectacle long overdue. Even those who once feared retaliation now leaned forward, eyes locked on the defendant's table, waiting to see what piece of the rotten foundation would crumble next. Meredith Grayson looked nothing like the woman who had once ruled the neighborhood, with icy charm. Her once perfect posture slouched, her designer blazer hung off her frame like a costume that no longer fit. The courtroom's fluorescent lights were unforgiving, highlighting the perspiration on her forehead and the twitch at the corner of her mouth. Brandon sat tall at the plaintiff's table, calm and steady, notebook open beside him. His lawyer, Donner, was about to deliver the 1-2 punch. He called the next witness, Shirley Wilkins, a former HOA secretary. Gasps broke out across the room as she took the stand. Shirley had mysteriously resigned months earlier, citing family health reasons, but everyone had suspected otherwise. Donner approached slowly. "Ms. Wilkins," he said gently, "why did you leave the HOA board?" She looked across the room, her gaze briefly landing on Meredith, who stared at her like a snake frozen mid-strike. "Because I didn't want to be part of it anymore," Shirley said. "What they were doing was wrong." "Can you elaborate?" "They had this unofficial list. People to watch. Brandon was on it. So were others who asked too many questions. Meredith called them troublemakers. She'd have Greg tow their cars or issue fines as a warning. It was personal, not policy." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Did you say this on the record to the board?" "I tried," Shirley whispered. "She threatened to sue me for breach of confidentiality. Said I'd never sell another house in the county again." In the gallery, someone muttered, "I knew it." Donner handed Shirley a copy of an HOA email chain, the one where Meredith called Brandon's car an eyesore that needs to disappear. Shirley nodded. "That's the one," she confirmed. "She wrote it. I remember being sick to my stomach reading it." The courtroom fell into an eerie stillness. Donner rested his hands on the table and turned to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." The defense declined to cross-examine. Meredith kept her eyes fixed on the floor, but the silence didn't last. The next witness was Timothy Cruz, a retired Marine who lived 3 houses down from Brandon. He wore his military cap-like armor and spoke with firm, clipped confidence. "I served 21 years for this country," he said, "and I've never been treated with more disrespect than I was by this HOA. They towed my daughter's car while she was visiting me. Said she looked like a renter." Meredith laughed about it at the meeting. "Did she apologize?" "No," she said, and I quote, "Maybe next time your family will read the bylaws. I've lived here longer than she's been alive." Each witness drove another nail into the coffin, fine by fine, toe by toe. What had once been a quiet rebellion had turned into a chorus of voices, all echoing the same truth. This HOA had become a weapon. And Meredith, she was unraveling fast. By the afternoon recess, her lawyer requested a private sidebar with the judge. 5 minutes later, the judge called both legal teams into chambers. Inside, Meredith finally broke. "I'll settle," she whispered. $30, no admission of wrongdoing. "We'll pay the legal fees." Donner didn't even blink. Brandon stood slowly. "Not enough," he said. "I want a public admission, and I want her off the board. Today." Meredith looked up, eyes rimmed red. "You don't understand. If I lose everything." Brandon leaned in, voice quiet and steady. "Good. That's what justice feels like." Rain tapped softly against the courthouse windows as the final day of trial began. The room felt electric, not loud, but heavy, like the air before a thunderclap. Brandon sat calmly at the front, dressed in a crisp navy suit. He looked nothing like the man who had once stood in his driveway, stunned and helpless, staring at the empty space where his car used to be. That man was gone. In his place sat someone who had taken on a machine and shaken its bolts loose. The jury filed in, faces unreadable, and the judge's voice rang out. "Court will now hear closing statements in the case of Lee versus Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." Meredith Grayson, meanwhile, looked like a statue left out in the rain. Her hair frizzed, her jaw clenched tight. Her lawyer had begged her to accept the revised settlement, $45,000 and a gag order, but Brandon had refused again. He wanted the truth on the record. Donner's closing was a scalpel, not a hammer. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, pacing slowly. "This case is about power, not just its abuse, but its assumption that no one would ever fight back." He gestured toward Brandon. "My client parked his car in his own driveway. He got no warning, no fine, and no courtesy. Just a tow truck in the dark of night, driven by the HOA president's brother, who we now know profited tens of thousands from illegal towing contracts. They took his car, then mocked him when he dared to ask why. He let that sink in. But this isn't just about Brandon. It's about every neighbor who lived in fear of retaliation. Every resident who kept their mouth shut to avoid a $100 fine or worse. This board forgot who they worked for. He turned back toward the jury. Help remind them. The defense said little, a vague reference to enforcement inconsistencies and interpretation of bylaws. But it was thin, shredded by weeks of testimony, surveillance footage, and internal emails. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was quiet but firm. We find in favor of the plaintiff, Brandon Lee. On all counts, a pause. We award compensatory damages in the amount of $50,000 and punitive damages of $25,000. Gasps rippled across the room. Meredith closed her eyes as if trying to block out the words, but it was too late. Cameras flashed. The judge struck the gavel and added her own decree. Furthermore, the court orders the immediate resignation of Meredith Grayson from all HOA positions and recommends referral to the district attorney's office for investigation into financial misconduct. There it was. Not just victory, vindication. Brandon stood, the weight of months lifting from his shoulders. He turned toward the packed courtroom, a sea of neighbors, some cheering quietly, some wiping away tears. These people had lived under silence, under fines, under fear. That silence had been shattered as he stepped out into the rain. Someone was waiting. A young journalist, recorder in hand. Mr. Lee, any comment on your win? Brandon smiled, calm and steady. They thought I was just one guy with a complaint. Turns out, I was one guy with a cause. Across town, Meredith was already clearing out her office. HOA members were calling an emergency vote to dissolve the board. A full audit was on the horizon. The tow trucks. Parked. Impound contracts. Cancelled. Brandon's Civic was back in his driveway, same spot, perfectly legal. But this time a hand-painted sign stood beside it. Planted in the grass. We don't tow cars here anymore. We tow corruption. 3 weeks after the verdict, Whispering Pines looked different, not in appearance. The lawns were still trimmed, the mailboxes still aligned with HOA precision, but the air had changed. There was laughter again on the sidewalks. Porch lights stayed on longer. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact now waved. They had lived under silent rule for so long, they forgot what freedom felt like. Meredith Grayson was gone. She had officially resigned within 24 hours of the ruling. Her property went up for sale the next week, and by the end of the month, a moving truck idled outside her once pristine home while she barked orders into a phone. Her empire reduced to taped-up boxes. No one helped. No one offered a farewell. The new HOA board formed quickly, this time elected through open ballots. No secret meetings. They asked Brandon to join. He declined. Fix it yourselves, he said with a wry smile. I'm tired of boardrooms, I prefer driveways. But he did agree to draft something they called the Homeowner's Bill of Rights, a binding code of conduct that ensured no vehicle could ever be towed without written notice. No fines could be issued without transparent appeals, and no family would be punished for asking questions. It passed unanimously. The tow company, Grayson Property Logistics, was dissolved. Greg Grayson disappeared from town like a shadow at dawn, and local authorities launched a formal investigation into improper contracts and fraudulent HOA expenditures. As for Brandon, he used part of his $75,000 to do something quiet, subtle, personal. He repaved his driveway, the same driveway where his car had vanished in the night. He resurfaced it with clean concrete and sealed it until it shined. Then he painted a single white rectangle near the bottom corner, not quite a space, not quite a line, just enough to make people ask. When neighbors inquired, Brandon only grinned and said, "That's where the trouble started." But that wasn't the end. One morning, weeks after everything had settled, Brandon opened his mailbox and found a white envelope with no return address. Inside was a folded slip of paper. No signature. Just 6 typed words. "You missed something. Look at April." No explanation. No context. Brandon's heart thud dead. He rushed inside, fired up his laptop, and pulled up the April HOA meeting minutes from the previous year. The only month he hadn't fully reviewed. And there it was. A strange expense entry listed under Emergency Community Enhancements. The payment, $14,200, paid to an LLC named Pine Shade Solutions. The recipient, a P.O. box in another county. He searched state records owner, Meredith Grayson. Pineshade wasn't a service provider. It was a fake vendor? She had been funneling HOA dues into her own pockets under a false name. Before the towing scheme even began, he sat back, stunned. This hadn't started with him. The illegal towing was only the surface. Meredith had been stealing long before Brandon's Civic was ever touched. He forwarded the discovery to Eric Donner. Within 48 hours, Donner filed a new civil complaint, this time for financial fraud, restitution, and criminal referral. And just like that, Brandon wasn't done. He smiled to himself as he stepped outside, the early morning sun casting a soft glow on the new pavement. A neighbor waved. A kid rode by on a bike. Laughing. Peace had returned to Whispering Pines. But Brandon knew now. Peace was something you had to fight for and protect. Because sometimes, all it takes is a crooked board member, a rigged tow, and a missing car to start a war, and if they ever tried it again, Brandon would be ready.